From the CyberHub bunker and studio, you're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast. And now for your host and CISO, James Azar.
Happy Friday, security gang. Welcome to an awesome episode of the CyberHub podcast. Jaime, welcome to the show, sir. How are you doing today?
Thank you, James. Great. No, things are great. Another week in paradise.
It is. I'm glad it's Friday, although, it's not a holiday Friday. I'm always weary of holiday Fridays, right? Because threat actors on a holiday Friday, they're always like, how can we screw up your holiday? Let's launch a bunch of ransomware, right? So it not being a holiday Friday, let's do that. And then, by the way, Father's Day is like 10 days away, so y'all just be mindful of that.
Definitely, yeah, careful with that.
All right, good. We're good with sound. We're good with sound there. We're good. All right, I got the thumbs up here. All right, awesome. So we're live. For those who don't know, this is what happens when you do a live show. You don't pre-record it, when you don't pre-script it, this is what happens. For those who don't know Jaime is the co-founder and CTO of Nudge Security. Nudge Security has been really kind to support the work of our podcast. Jaime is coming to talk to us about supply chain risks today, really on the SaaS side of the world. So your questions, your comments, bring those in, incorporate them. This is a lively discussion. So take part in it. For those who don't know Jaime's background, Jaime was previously the chief scientist over at Alien Vault, pre their acquisition, right? Pre getting acquired by AT&T. He's been in security for quite some time, done a lot of research on the threat side of the house. So he's a practitioner. He knows what he's talking about. So ask away. You get a chance at picking at Jaime today, so do it. And let's go right about that. So for everyone kind of tuning in today, I kind of want to start off, Jaime, by asking you one question. What's the misconception you think CISOs or security practitioners have about SaaS security?
I would say the biggest one is that, and I've seen this over and over again, especially with large organizations that have been doing security for a while already, and they have made investments a long time ago. The misconception is they believe the existing controls work in a SaaS world, and that's not the case, right? If you try to do SaaS security with network controls, well, let me tell you something, you're going to have a really hard time because you're not going to get the visibility that you need. So that's really the biggest challenge that I see for organizations today, like that those controls no longer work in this world.
So when you talk about specific controls, are you specifically talking about the types of controls that we would apply in IT governance that we think carry over to SaaS? Is that kind of the specific aspect of controls you speak with that just don't really go to SaaS?
Well, really everything, right? Like think about all the investments you did in endpoint security and network security. Pretty much you have to throw all of those, away in a SaaS world, right? Because first, you don't have that visibility. Your employees can be accessing those services from any number of locations and devices. And more importantly, you don't see anything around how that SaaS vendor is behaving, how that connectivity between SaaS vendors happen. You don't have that visibility. And more importantly, you don't know anything about the configuration and threat information from those services, right? From those traditional controls and investment that you have already done. And, there's a little bit you can do from your existing XDR or SIEM capabilities, but those are usually not very well suited for this.
Yeah, so you're bringing up something that I remember early on in the SaaS days. We used to call it the shared responsibility model. And it seems like over the last 3-4 years, that shared responsibility model has really kind of disappeared from the SaaS to customer relationship. Why? Do you know? Do you have insights?
Well, definitely, you see large companies like, AWS obviously was the one that kind of like market this concept, but, even Google and Microsoft, you have a fair amount of efforts on that side. But then, think about this is not a problem just with those vendors, right? We we have a catalog of like hundreds of thousands of SaaS vendors out there. Anything from like 3 guys in a garage to a multi-billion organization like a Snowflake, right? That have a huge security team and a lot of capabilities in the product to help you improve your security posture. As we have seen recently with a Snowflake, a few weeks ago, right? Like I'm pretty sure all of you are aware of that incident. But the fact that when you deploy, a SaaS application like a Snowflake, you still need to make sure that you configure access accordingly. Things like MFA, things like session timeout. So if one of your employees gets compromised and they steal cookies or credentials, a threat actor, you can mitigate that risk of a threat actor using those credentials. And that's something that is Snowflake or any other SaaS vendor is not going to do for you, right? It's something that you have to understand and you have to do for every of the SaaS services that you utilize.
Yeah, I mean, the shared responsibility model to me is the basics of where the border lies between what I'm responsible for as a SaaS vendor to what you're responsible for as a practitioner or as a customer or consumer of my technology or product, right? And that's really kind of, the fact that that's kind of fallen off the wayside is almost really disturbing because it's created that gray area. And you're right, Amazon cloud providers do that. They do it fairly well, right? The Google, the Azures, the AWSs, Oracle, they do it fairly well. But then when you go to, like you mentioned, a recent victim of a crime like Snowflake, or, you go to any Intuit product that's SaaS based or anything like that, it's very hard for the average person to identify what's my responsibility, right? Like what am I responsible for? Responsible for having a strong password. I'm responsible for MFA. I'm responsible for access management. I'm responsible for, ensuring that I've got the right policies in play within the dashboard security center to ensure that, I don't have any proprietary like PII data sitting here unencrypted, like social security numbers or credit card numbers, or so forth and so forth. That shared responsibility model has really kind of gone away. And as it's gone, it's really kind of escalated in a way it's really added more confusion for practitioners. When you look at third-party risk management and supply chain, right, and especially in the SaaS world, if you were sitting in my chair as a CISO, Jaime, how would you start to approach kind of comprehending that SaaS risk to your business? Because
yeah, I think it starts with again, like making sure you have good visibility and tracking of your ecosystem, right? Like a lot of the customers we work with, like many of them initially they're like, well, we are pretty good. Like we have the inventory of all the SaaS vendors. And then when we do an assessment, well, let me tell you reality, you knew about 30% of them, right? There's so many relationships and so many types of SaaS services that you utilize and that you may not be aware. Things like free SaaS services, connectors that are installing those SaaS services, right? It's not just the SaaS service, but it's the app-to-app integrations that your employees can do across the services. And then even for the ones that you are paying for and the ones that are being utilized, a lot of those are not even known by IT and security teams, right? So first of all, how can you make sure the proper security controls are in those services if you don't even know about them? Now, once you have that inventory, making sure that you have visibility in the configuration, that you have a way to automate assessment of that configuration and making sure that those settings are properly configured, making sure that you have a strong a strong identity and story about all those SaaS applications. Like, are they behind SSO? That brings me to another point, which is like even in a shared responsibility model, a lot of these players are really good at putting those things behind a paywall, right? And the example is SSO, right? Or well, let's talk about Microsoft, right? Like Microsoft is probably the best example of someone that is trying to make money out of security features, right? Where if you are trying to do the right thing in their platform, many times you have to pay a license, an enterprise license, to implement certain security controls. And we see that across the board, especially with SSO, right? That SSO tax that we call in the industry, which is you have to buy an enterprise license in order to be able to integrate SSO. So I think as an industry, we need to push back in those SaaS vendors and make sure that that doesn't happen, because like otherwise we are not doing the basics, right? I mean, SSO and MFA should be the bare minimum that you do in these platforms, and many times it's not easy when you implement these solutions.
So I'm going to give you the SSO tax pushback that a lot of people, whenever you see these discussions across, some of our Slack channels or at events and so forth, CISOs, we're often fighting for budget. You know this better. You speak to a lot of customers that nudge, that like, yeah, we're working to try to find budget, try to get a little bit more money in there. And so there's really two ways for a CISO to try to show return on investment to finance in order to budget and get more money for security. One is owning identity across the board. Let me own internal and external identity. Don't let that be owned by product. Let that be owned by security. You put in a security architect, you're putting in your engineers, you're designing the identity across the entire ecosystem. Identity is a great way to really embed security in a product and in the ROI, reducing risk, reducing fraud, increasing customer satisfaction, the whole nine, right? There's that aspect to it. And so SSO at that point becomes a tax, because the CISO, who's also complaining about the SSO tax, has to sell it as a feature where we can get more money from enterprise customers, right? We're going to get more money from enterprise customers to do SSO rather than a 5-person shop. And so this is the catch-22 that exists for security practitioners. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's the dilemma we sit in. You're right. We shouldn't have an SSO tax, but I'd love to find a better way to get more money out of my CFO or get more money for my security program without having to own part of a commercial product and have to highlight the revenue of it. All right, our sales team, because there's a measurable tactic, right? We sold an additional, 120 enterprise accounts because of SSO. That generated an extra $10 million in revenue. Can I get $2 million to do X? Yes, because you've generated an extra 10 million in revenue. So absolutely, we want you to do all those other initiatives because now we see value in that. I'm not saying that's right. I know I can see the comments coming. I can see some of the people writing stuff online. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is there's got to be that balance. And this kind of goes down to the concept of, that shared responsibility model. We go back to that. Should SSO be available to everyone? Yes. I think MFA should be available to everyone. I think if you're selling MFA as part of enterprise, that's bad. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. To me, SSO should never be something that SaaS companies use to differentiate offerings. You need to provide value to your customers, and value that is your platform, right? But not security features. I don't see security features as value that you can charge more for, to be honest. And there may be some, exceptions to that if as a vendor it incurs a huge cost to my business, some specific controls. I get that. But in general, anyone can provide MFA and SSO at a minimum cost nowadays, right? It's not like something maybe 10, 15 years ago that might have been harder. But nowadays we have platforms that do that at a very cost-effective, way. So I don't think vendors really have a lot of excuses today. And to be fair, I've seen this, I've been there. I usually see this coming internally from sales and marketing teams rather than technical decisions and product decisions, right? So,
well, yeah, because sales and marketing teams are trying to leverage it. You're absolutely correct. When we talk about third-party risk, we talk about SaaS risk. I think there's another aspect to it, right? Which is how much visibility do I want to have and how much control do I have, right? We talk about third-party supply chain risk and SaaS vendors, but our SaaS vendors aren't, it's not just one, but it's multiple SaaS vendors, right? We can have, fourth and fifth degree vendors there as well. Where do you draw the line? What, because if you're liable, and as we've seen with Tim Brown over at SolarWinds, they love to take action. We've seen that with Joe Sullivan, with Tim Brown. What do you make a third and fourth party, and fifth party type of visibility where you may not have a direct relationship, but you see a risk?
Yeah, that it really depends on the organization, the resources that you have, and what applications are critical to you, right? Like an example is actually last week, Hugging Face had an incident, right, where tokens were likely stolen. And for those of you that you don't know, like Hugging Face is like the GitHub for AI applications, right? They literally they're the primary provider of where people store models, machine learning models and things like that, and data sets. So used by a lot of organizations out there. In that case, even if you're not a direct customer of Hugging Face, and also very important here, many enterprises out there are going to be using Hugging Face for free, right? And that's the other point with vendor security reviews, that it might not be something you pay for, but it's still critical to you. But then my point is you're going to have a lot of other vendors that are actually using Hugging Face to when it comes to some of their AI capabilities, right? So in that case, I think it's a really good exercise to be able to map that supply chain, so that fourth party risk, and make sure that you have visibility into what are your critical vendors that might be using Hugging Face, and have a conversation with them. And if there's a risk that you identify, there's some quick wins that you can do, right? You could reset passwords, you could revoke tokens or API keys that you already have. So there's some really quick wins that you can execute when these things happen. You don't need to get very sophisticated, and you don't need to do this for every single breach that happens. But for the important ones, definitely you should have a plan in place, because we see these things happening more often than not these days.
Yeah, you're right about that. But I think you bring up another really important piece here, right? Which is, Avi here says that in some cases, the SSO tax is to allow for extra features. And you're right, it is. It could allow for extra features. But then again, there's the question of, most enterprises, when I'm going to negotiate and I'm an enterprise, I'm not paying the SSO tax. I'm already going on an enterprise plan. I'm essentially doing it. You're really kind of making the victims less secure by charging them extra, because the people who need it, is that he's given an example of Adelazian. You have to buy the access product in order to get their SSO. So I don't know. What's your take on that, Jaime? Do you feel like, I don't want to go into the SSO tax discussion necessarily very deep, but there is a challenge with that supply chain with third and fourth and fifth party vendors, where SSO becomes really critical, where monitoring those tokens is really important, and a lot of times you don't have control over it. How do you kind of go about minimizing that risk?
Yeah, and again, back to square one, right? I think it does start with visibility. When we work with customers, they don't have really good visibility into those supply chains, and a lot of the work that people have done is really around software supply chains, and not what we call SaaS supply chains, right? We believe that software is a huge risk, and we have seen huge issues with that, obviously infamous Log4j, etc. But we are seeing this happen with SaaS applications more often. And to be fair with you, I see in some cases that creates much more risk than something like software supply chain. Back to the reason that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, that people already have done really big investments on traditional security controls that can mitigate that risk from a software perspective, right? You have endpoint controls, you have network controls, and that can mitigate a little bit of that, supply chain risk if you are doing the right things. Obviously, that's not always the case. But when it comes to SaaS vendors, that's a little bit different, right? Because you not may have the tools and the processes to mitigate that risk if one of the SaaS vendors, either third or fourth party, gets compromised.
Yeah, I mean, what you talk about is and I completely agree with it. A lot of people look at SaaS security and they think of it as access risk, but there are additional risks. There's data risk, obviously there's financial risk and business continuity risks. How do you balance those, in your opinion? Like, we talked about the misconceptions early on of, the shared responsibility, but how do you really kind of encompass the whole risk that exists within SaaS?
Yeah, no, I mean, you got a good point there, right? At the end of the day, you have to just like have a conversation with your business around risk and about what matters to your specific business, right? It doesn't matter, if you have a SaaS vendor that gets compromised, if there is no data in there, or there's no, it's not really being utilized in any meaningful way, with some exceptions, like, you may have security SaaS, security SaaS vendors or identity SaaS vendors, right? We have seen Okta being compromised a few times already, and that creates a lot of risk to the organization, even if it's used for only like a portion of the organization or something like that, because that can be used to actually move laterally in your environment through that compromise. And so back to what you said, right? Like, yeah, look at what data is stored, look at what data is important for your business. And then from a continuity perspective, like, what type of business are you running, right? If that service goes down, does that affect your business, or it's something that, is not critical? So again, you have to do that exercise internally and understand, what the risk is for each of those vendors and which are the critical ones that should be paying more attention to.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, one of my challenges as a CISO is whenever I look at depth of scope, right? I want to have the visibility. Shadow SaaS exists; it's a thing, right? Grateful there's a company like Nudge out there that, for those who've missed all of the Nudge ads on our podcast, you should go check them out. They're still going to be there for quite some time now, so go check it out. But once you find your shadow SaaS, there becomes a greater challenge, right? And the greater challenge is, if I've got 4 people using a program, right, a specific SaaS provider, let's say from a team, and it doesn't matter what function of business they are, I always end up having to look at the type of controls you put in place. And one of the big challenges I have is, and I think many practitioners have, is you go, how engaged do you want to be around your SaaS ecosystem? Because it becomes very much like your old IT ecosystem where you find shadow IT. Someone's got an extra laptop, an extra server somewhere, data sitting out somewhere. What's your response to something like that?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's what we see in many organizations is there are many ways you can mitigate risk, and this is a partnership many times between IT, security, and finance, right? Because mitigating risk sometimes, like the example you gave of 3 people using one tool, is like, well, maybe we're already paying for another tool that does the same job they don't know about. Maybe the risk mitigation is actually getting them out of that tool and giving them access to another tool we already are paying for. So there's many things that you can do when you partner with finance and IT, and not just in your security role as a whole. But then obviously, if they have to use that tool, you can do an assessment of, well, have we done a vendor security review? What type of security controls they allow? From an SSPM perspective, right? We see a market being created around SSPM for those of you that don't know. That's like SaaS security posture management, which is mainly looking at configuration of those services. The challenge we see with that is like most of the vendors out there support like tens of vendors, And in best cases, they support 100 vendors. But let me tell you something, again, there are hundreds of thousands of SaaS vendors out there. And many times the ones that are going to get you in trouble are the small ones, right? Are the ones that don't have APIs, the ones that your SSPM solution doesn't support, the ones that your employees are using without you knowing about. That you will never have SSPM coverage because you don't even know that that service is being used. So there are many things you can do before that around, basic hygiene of those services. Like, do they have MFA enabled? Do they even support MFA? Does the service support SSO either with attacks or without attacks? Is it integrated into our SSO provider? Do we have, how do we offboard employees from those tools that we don't control when they leave the organization? Can they live with a username and password and still access those tools? So there's a lot of basic hygiene things that you can do to take control over those things before you investments in terms of like more exotic security controls of things like SSPM, IDTR things like that. You do the basics, right? That's gonna mitigate a lot of the risk that you already have.
So as we kind of hit the bottom half of the hour here and we're wrapping up, I'd like to ask you, Jaime, if you could give our audience, our listeners, any sort of advice around, how to gain tactical wins in supply chain, what would they be?
Yeah, I think, again, back to, I think it will be really, really useful for you if you haven't done it already, is update your incident response plans and your disaster recovery plans to take into account these scenarios, right? Where, one of your critical SaaS vendors gets compromised or something that affects that vendor gets compromised. And then run those scenarios and understand what the impact will be for you. And then have, response plans in place on how to mitigate that risk, right? And again, that can be anything as easy as prompting all the users of that platform to reset passwords, to enable MFA, to delete the data, to make sure you don't have app-to-app integrations with those vendors, and making sure that you revoke those tokens and you are able to map all those relationships when that happens. So you limit the lateral movement that those threat actors could do if they get access to that SaaS vendor. So I will say focus on identity, basic hygiene, MFA, SSO, and the ability to mitigate risk when that compromise happens in terms of rotating credentials, tokens, API keys, things like that, and potentially and getting out of there as quickly as possible if it's a pretty bad a scenario where you have to do that, right? And then even before that, it comes back to visibility, right? We work with a lot of customers that send us emails like being like, oh my gosh, you saved my day, because like we send breach notifications when SaaS vendors get compromised, right? And just to give you an idea, this year alone, we have seen companies like Hugging Face, HelloSign, Dual Security, Big Panda, Sisense, like tons of them. This is something that happens everywhere, right? When we send those notifications, many times people are like, wait, but I don't use HelloSign. And it's like, well, let me tell you what, that company that you acquired a year ago, there is a finance department that is using HelloSign and you were not aware of, because like IT wasn't managing that. So many times it's that visibility that saves, that is the basic things that you have to do, right? When this happens, if you don't have that basic inventory, there's nothing you can do because you're not gonna know what to do. So again, just fix that and then go to some of the things that I said around identity, around response and disaster recovery plans.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. And then the other thing for everyone listening and watching is you can go to nudgesecurity.com/CyberHub. You can get a 14-day free trial of Nudge Security's platform. So you can go do that again, nudgesecurity.com/CyberHub. And on top of everything Jaime just said, which doesn't cost any money, you can also use the Nudge tool for free for 14 days and get everything you need there as well. Jaime, thank you so much for coming on the show. And thanks for everyone for all of your comments and so forth. Really, so some great conversations in the chats. Jaime, any last words?
No, I mean, I think we cover most of the things. I think the other thing that just to give you some, what we are seeing in the market out there in our customers, right? Something that we have seen boards very interested. Well, like security and IT teams come to us because they are like, well, someone on the board asked about, how our employees are using AI, and we couldn't answer that question. So the way we see that is that AI, Gen AI is basically a subset of the same problem that we are dealing with, right? Which is making that SaaS problem even more acute, because all of a sudden you have all these employees wanting to use the latest, hottest, Gen AI tool, and once you take a look, all of a sudden you have 100 different, Gen AI tools being used in your environment. Just, my recommendation is like get ahead of the problem, right? Because it gets complicated very quickly, and we have seen organizations like struggling with taking control over that. And on the other hand, like the problem is like, do you go to a world where you block everything so your employees can do their job? And what happens when you do that is like, well, guess what? Your employees are gonna leave because they're tired of not being able to use any tool that they like. So we have seen that as well, which is like many organizations don't want to take that approach of, you can't do anything in the environment. So you always need to find that right balance between blocking everything and making sure that there is some buffer where your employees are able to use the tools that they like to use. And obviously IT, security, finance, they should all work together to make sure that happens.
Yeah, you've got to be able to. You can't say no. You can't block something without having a good explanation. And even if you explain it well, if someone needs to use it and that's their job, it's going to cost a whole lot more headaches than anything else. You've got to be able to find the right tools to support what the people in the business need to do in order to create great products and provide awesome support to your customers. If you can't do that, then you have no business practicing security. If your idea of practicing security is we're locking everything down and we're shutting down all the doors, history will teach you that everyone who locked themselves down in a fort burnt in it and never kept anyone out. Eventually people get in. There's no way to just lock everything down and hope no one gets in. People always find a way in, or they'll find a way around it. So find the right security partners to help you adapt to the needs of your business and of your teams, and understand those needs and highlight them correctly. That's the best way to go about it. You're absolutely correct about that. By the way, the whole, AI discussion around Gen AI, is I'm going to shut it down. No one can do it any tools. All right. They're going to do it at home. And most people are remote. So they're doing it on a different device, because I guarantee you every employee's got two laptops on their desk, their personal one and their company. And if they can't do something on their company laptop, what are they doing? They're doing something on their personal laptop. So you got to get away from that endpoint approach. You got to go down the identity approach. You got to go down the SaaS approach. You've really got to evolve the way you think about security from an endpoint perspective to an identity perspective. And once you go down that identity path, then it becomes much easier to tackle challenges like SaaS, supply chain, AI, and everything else. But if you're still stuck in the ways of old, I'm sorry, you're playing you're playing an old game that's not relevant. You're not even competing anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean you nail it, and it's again that concept of many times, like the example of Gen AI, right? Like if you decide, well, we're gonna block everything, we don't want employees to use any chatbots, right? What's gonna happen is, let me tell you what, there are thousands of them, so they're gonna find one that works, and that's gonna be the one that you don't want them to use, right? Because you haven't blocked it, but it's like run by like two residents in a basement, and you don't even know what they're doing with the data, right? So many times when you push these things away, you resurface like very SaaS vendors that might be not might not be the ones that you want your employees to use. So just be aware of those things, especially with Gen AI. It's just, it's a kind of, you need to be aware of.
Yes, you do. Jaime, thank you so much for taking time to join the show this morning. I really do appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Go check out nudgesecurity.com/CyberHub for your 14-day free trial of the product. Have a great weekend, y'all. Thank you. Thank you so much. And most importantly, stay cyber safe. Cheers, y'all.
Thank you.
We love feedback, so make sure to connect with us on social media and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform.